Hello, welcome back to another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm your host, Steven Roy Goodman. I'm here in Washington, D.C., where we're going to be speaking about legacy admission. And I'm here with Richard Kahlenberg, who is a senior scholar, non-resident scholar at Georgetown School of Public Policy. Welcome.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me, Steve.
Well, thanks for being here. Well, maybe if we could start with legacy admission, the definition. What is legacy admission?
Well, legacy admissions is the system in which the children of alumni are given a preference in admissions. So a student who might otherwise have a mediocre chance of getting in suddenly has a quite good chance of getting in merely because their parents, or one of their parents, went to that college.
And now, in the interest of full disclosure, you wrote a book against legacy admissions. But can you maybe bring us to the pros and the cons of why a university would do this in the first place?
The argument that universities will make in favor of legacy preferences is that they're trying to build an intergenerational community, and that there will be more loyalty from alumni if they think their children have a good chance of going to the institution. There is an argument that's made, contested, I would say, that the existence of legacy preferences increases donations from alumni. So that's the other thing that universities will say. So those are the arguments that are advanced. On the other side, there are a whole host of questions people raise about legacy preferences. First is kind of fundamentally the question of fairness. We fought a revolution in this country to get away from aristocracy, the idea of inherited privilege, the notion that ancestry should matter and who gets ahead in life. So if you look at public opinion polling on this question, about 3/4 of Americans think it's unfair and oppose the idea of legacy preferences. There's also a question that's present in everyone's mind today about the impact on racial diversity. So most of the alumni tend to be, or more likely to be white, more likely to be wealthy. And so if universities are genuine in their commitment to making sure that they have a diverse student body, diverse by economic status, diverse by race, then legacy preferences are really kind of the last thing you'd want to do. And that's particularly relevant now that the Supreme Court has recently struck down race-based affirmative action. So I think fairness, diversity, and then the final thing is that opponents of legacy preferences, of which I am one, contest the evidence that in fact it increases donations from alumni. So in the book that I edited, it's called Affirmative Action for the Rich, there was a chapter which analyzed this question of whether in fact alumni give more money when there is a legacy preference in place. And they compared 75 universities in the top 100 at US News and World Report that had legacy preferences against the 25 that didn't, and found no meaningful difference in alumni giving between those types of institutions. And there's further research to suggest that yes, alumni giving does increase when a child is in their high school years, about to apply to college. You do see a bump up in in alumni giving. But so many alumni children are actually rejected today, even with a preference. It's just gotten so competitive at a lot of these institutions. And so when the parents find out that their child is rejected, they're furious and they just stop giving to the institution altogether. So it's not even clear that it accomplishes the goal that was intended. Last thing I'll say on that is that I was an expert witness in the litigation about race-based affirmative action in Harvard and University of North Carolina. And one of the things I said was that you can create racial diversity, which is very important, by giving a break to economically disadvantaged students and getting rid of legacy preferences. And that was a great opportunity for Harvard and the University of North Carolina to come forth with evidence that, well, we can't do this because, we can't get rid of legacy preferences because it will really damage us financially. And they provided no evidence whatsoever. If they had it, that was their opportunity to do so, but they didn't provide it.
Well, speaking of that evidence, what would you advise the University of North Carolina to do if, on one hand, they want to increase the number of people who care about the University of North Carolina, but on the other hand, they have a fiduciary responsibility to the state to balance their books?
Well, I think that there are lots of opportunities actually now with the Supreme Court decision on race-based affirmative action to go out and raise more money because basically the Supreme Court created a crisis in higher education. Because Americans, they've never liked racial preferences, but they also do want racial diversity on campus. And so this is an opportunity for a place like University of North Carolina to go out and talk to their alumni, talk to others who might want to provide support and say, racial diversity is enormously important to us. We're going to have to find new ways to get there. And so I've had some admissions officers say that they think this is going to be an opportunity to increase donations in other ways. Not from alumni in the sense that your kid is going to benefit, but rather, listen, we need your help because this is a moment where we want to make sure we continue to provide a racially diverse environment, and that's going to cost more money than it did in the past.
But let's say we had a representative here today from a small private college that didn't have the name of Harvard or UNC. They might say, perhaps not in front of the cameras, they might say, look, we don't have the ability to raise this kind of money, so we need the legacy students to come because but for that, we wouldn't generate maybe not all the money that you said in your book that they had or didn't have, but the enthusiasm and the name recognition of the school within a sub-part of the admissions pool. We really need that. How would you respond to that?
Well, there are lots of institutions that have eliminated legacy preferences, and they have not received a terrible pushback from their alumni and a decrease in donations. So most recently, Wesleyan decided to eliminate legacy preferences. Before that, Johns Hopkins. There are a number that have taken this step. Occidental College, Carleton College, the list goes on and on. So I think there are ways to encourage community without saying we're going to give an unfair preference to your child. It's not an either or, in my view.
Well, let me turn slightly differently if I can. So, when I'm not doing this show, I help students who are applying to colleges and universities, and very often moms and dads will come in to see me and they'll say, I went to the University of XYZ, and what kind of advantage would that be for my son or daughter? How would you advise people like me in that role to deal with legacy?
If you're advising people on where the children should apply, I think it would be appropriate to notify them that, in fact, this institution provides a legacy preference, and you play by the rules as they're given. You may even have kind of a fiduciary obligation to tell them that. But there are some students, an increasing number of students, who are uncomfortable with that. When I went to college, and I was a beneficiary of a legacy preference, there was no stigma attached to it whatsoever. Unfortunately, there was stigma unfairly attached to Black and Hispanic students, but no one really thought anything of legacy preferences. That's changed. And now on selective campuses, there is a stigma attached to students whose parents went to the institution because people know how the world works and that they got an unfair preference. And so, so that would be also part of the advice I would suggest you make, is that yes, you have an increased chance of going to the institution where your parents went, but there may be a cost associated with that as well once you're on campus, and you should be aware of that.
One of the things that I find really interesting about the point you just made is I deal with a lot of student athletes as well. And when student athletes apply to various universities, they expect that they're going to get a bump in admissions.
I think the difference, well, I should step back and say I'm not a big fan of the student athlete preference either, because it tends to be used for a lot of kind of boutique sports that benefit wealthy white people, squash and fencing and all these others at fancy schools. So I'm not an advocate of them. Having said that, there is a big moral distinction, I think, between athletic preferences and legacy preferences. So a student who worked their butt off to become a great football player or a great basketball player through intense discipline is, to me, different than someone who, through no doing of their own, benefits from the fact that their mommy or daddy went to that institution. One is connected to notions of merit, and the other isn't. And so, I find the legacy preferences much more troubling than athletic preferences.
And how would you compare the legacy preferences to sons and daughters of people who work at College X or College Y?
Well, that issue came up in the litigation as well, and Harvard provides a substantial preference to children of faculty and staff. And you would think if it were an equal preference for, the chair of the history department and the custodian, that you would see lots of economic and racial diversity among the students who were admitted. That wasn't the case. It tended to be wealthier and white students. And so the suspicion there is that when they say they're going to give a preference to the children of faculty and staff, it's faculty who get the big bonus. And in the testimony, one of the things I found discouraging is one of Harvard's expert witnesses, Ruth Simmons, said, oh, Harvard needs that faculty preference because otherwise it won't be able to attract good faculty members, which I found astonishing, that would be said with a straight face, as if professors are deciding which institution to go to only based on where their kid is going to get an unfair preference. I think it's the same principle applies as with legacy. This has nothing to do with the merit of the student. It's only what their parent happens to do. Instinctively, I'm a little bit more sympathetic to the idea that the custodian's kid gets a break, but that's not what happens in practice. And instead of providing a preference to faculty and staff children, you could just do it based on socioeconomic status anyway, so that custodian child does get a preference, not based on affiliation with the institution, but rather because that student faced extra obstacles. The parent may not have high levels of education, may struggle economically compared to a lot of the applicants.
It seems to me that you're saying very politely there's a difference between what somebody says and what somebody does. And if in fact what we see here is that, yes, the benefit goes to the tenured history professor as opposed to the custodian's child, then do you think that the Supreme Court is essentially saying to the universities now, well, you can do that, but now you have to raise money and pay for the students who you say that you want?
This is the paradox of the Supreme Court's decision on affirmative action. I'm a liberal Democrat, And so most of my friends thought the decision was terrible. I think it actually is going to be a win for working class students. And the reason I say that is institutions do care about racial diversity. To their credit, they want a racially diverse class. They took the easy way out and brought in fairly wealthy students of all colors in the past. Now they're going to have to do the hard work of making sure that they're going to admit working class students, a disproportionate share of whom are Black and Hispanic. Consider eliminating practices like legacy, since they interfere with racial diversity, and really reinvent the admissions system. And that's why I've contended that a conservative Supreme Court decision on race paradoxically could lead to a host of really liberal public policy initiatives, efforts to make sure that economically disadvantaged students of all races get a break in admissions, increases in financial aid, and I think there is, I know there is public support for racial diversity, and so that with that comes the potential for more resources, public resources for institutions to make this new system work. So in the 1990s, when Florida and Texas eliminated the use of race in admissions, Republican governors in those states did not simply give up on diversity. They said diversity is a good thing and we need to find new ways, and they ponied up more money for new scholarships that had not existed before the end of race-based affirmative action in those states. So to the extent that that is a precedent, then I'm optimistic that we will, as a country, find the resources necessary to transition to a new and fairer form of affirmative action that includes the elimination of legacy preferences at many institutions.
Well, you're raising the issue of politics here. Maybe if I can push that politics button a little bit more. So if we're talking about working class students, what if some of them are sons and daughters of Republicans? And that makes some colleges in New England uncomfortable to have a disproportionate number of students now coming who are more conservative than perhaps they're used to.
I think that would be a wonderful thing. To the extent that admitting more working class students of all races, including some working class white students, brings intellectual diversity, brings different points of view to the table, I think that's a good thing for everyone. I mean, as a liberal, I went to Harvard, I was surrounded by other liberals. And I didn't sharpen my intellectual skills because I didn't have to do combat with conservatives. Then you get in the real world and you find out there's a whole different set of views that a lot of Americans have. So I think that would actually be a very positive thing if universities became more heterodox in their political leanings. I mean, the polling on this is off the charts. I mean, where you have 80–90% of students identifying as liberal. That's not good for, it's not good for universities because they're completely out of touch with America. And it's not good for those liberal students either because they're not learning from others who have different points of view.
Well, speaking about the different points of view, what about faculty members who may disagree with administrators in terms of dealing with legacy? So, for instance, people have spent their whole careers recruiting students who are sons and daughters of people who went to that university. How do they now deal with the administrators to say, well, we're not going to do that anymore?
Well, I think there's going to be an adjustment for a whole set of folks, and time to rethink. But the politics of this are interesting because most of those admissions officers who are used to admitting legacy students are also going to be deeply committed to racial diversity. And in the past, they could have their cake and eat it too. They could admit the legacy applicants and they could admit underrepresented minority students through race-based affirmative action. And in fact, there was kind of a symbiotic relationship between legacy preferences and affirmative action. Supporters of affirmative action liked legacy preferences because they could say, listen, the system's not meritocratic. There are all sorts of preferences. Race is just one of them. And supporters of legacy preferences liked race-based affirmative action because it provided some diversity on campus and made the whole system appear fair, even though there were lots of unfairnesses in the system. And so now that deal is over, affirmative action is gone, race-based affirmative action is gone, and so that's putting intense pressure on institutions to decrease the emphasis on legacies. And I think admissions officers will recognize that. And even if they're used to using legacy preferences in the past, I think many will recognize this is defeating another really important goal of the university, which is to produce racial diversity in the classroom.
So it seems as if you're saying that there's almost like a public policy and a private policy coming together.
Yes, I think that's right. I think we're going to see institutions changing their behavior in order to produce a better set of results. And I think we'll see the public support of universities manifest itself as well. There's research going back 20, 30 years finding that people didn't like racial preferences, do like racial diversity, do like the idea of giving a break to economically disadvantaged students. And so I think we'll see the public and the institutions become more aligned, where they had been completely at odds. Elites believed in race-based preferences, the public didn't. Now they can come around together to a system of providing an advantage to economically disadvantaged students and eliminating policies like legacy preferences that did the exact opposite.
And what about the thumb on the scale for young men?
I have concerns about that policy for a couple of reasons. One is, again, we're getting back to the idea that we're judging applicants based on something they have no control over, not based on the strength of their individual profile. And the other piece is that there is, of course, an irony here that historically men have had all sorts of advantages and continue in many ways to have all sorts of advantages in life. And the idea that these hardworking girls who did everything right, did everything that was expected of them, and are yet penalized because of their gender ought to be troubling to a lot of us. I understand the university's argument. They say if you get an imbalance, we become less attractive. But I think that universities do need to consider the fairness of the process and figure out a way to make sure that they can be providing a great learning environment for everyone, but also do it in a way that they can publicly explain. And the idea that we don't have right now universities coming out and admitting publicly, of course we prefer the boys because there aren't enough of them. I mean, that would be, I think, really troubling to a lot of people.
But in terms of the fairness that you just raised a second ago, I think there's an issue of what is really fair and the perception of fairness. Mm-hmm. They're not exactly the same.
Well, I think there's been a disconnect with the way admissions officers think about who gets in and the way the public thinks about it. So the public recognizes that university admissions matter because certain people get a ticket that will take them to good places in life, and that they want that system to be fair. They want people to be judged on the merits. And university admissions officers would say, oh, that's very unsophisticated. We know better, and we want to create a class that's going to be interesting to everyone and provide educational benefits. And I guess my argument is that if you consider economic disadvantage in the admissions process, you can get both. You can get that interesting set of students from a variety of backgrounds, and at the same time create an admission system that you can explain to the public and the public will accept as fundamentally fair.
But to get back to your earlier point, that costs a lot of money.
Yes, it does cost more money, and that's why universities haven't done it. They'd rather do, racial justice on the cheap by bringing in the most advantaged students of color to sit alongside the most advantaged white and Asian students. And so, but the Supreme Court decision is a wake-up call, and they're going to have to come up with new ways and make sure that they have the resources to get there.
The Supreme Court specifically did a carve-out for military schools.
That's right.
Could you say a word or two about what you think about that carve-out, and whether or not you think that's a reasonable carve-out?
I thought it was an interesting political move by the court. Clearly there was some controversy within the 6 members of the majority about whether military folks should be, military institutions should be affected by this. And so there was a political accommodation to carve that out. I know that conservative groups have already brought a case, to press that point and say that that the same rules ought to apply to the military as everyone else, and we'll see where that goes.
One of the affirmative action cases before this most recent one, a number of generals and admirals wrote extensively in supporting affirmative action.
That's right, and I think they are right to suggest that racial diversity in the military and the military leadership is incredibly important, just as I think racial diversity at non-military schools is important. What I think the generals are missing is that you can create racial diversity through other means that don't involve treating people differently based on race. That is to say, when we crunch the numbers in the Harvard and UNC cases, that if universities did give a more aggressive boost to economically disadvantaged students, they can get racial diversity, and they can maintain high academic standards, and so it's possible to do that with what they refer to as race-neutral alternatives, giving a break to economically disadvantaged students. That's where I would disagree with the generals. The goal, I think, is very important, but there are other ways to get there. And if in the end the military has to comply with the same rules that every other institution has to abide by, then I think the military will figure it out and find new ways to get racial diversity.
Well, fair enough. Richard, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, great to be with you, Steve. Enjoyed the conversation.
Well, me too. Thank you. If you would like additional information about Richard, you can go to georgetown.edu. If you'd like to send a note to me at the show, please go ahead and do so by sending an email to highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. And thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.